snap. The sound was dry, short, and as unalterable as a sentence passed upon silence. Verena did not need to open her eyes to know that the ratchet mechanism had just released the magnetic bolt lock. She had exactly 60 seconds. Not a second more. Not a second less. She stood with her legs wide apart before the console of airlock. 021 in Sector Delta. Her hand, encased in a heavy, gray industrial glove, rested on a lever of cold titanium. This was a metal that never warmed from the heat of her skin. On the contrary, it seemed as if the lever was sucking the remnants of temperature from her body, turning her blood into a freezing, thick emulsion. She did not look at the digital counter. She did not have to. She felt the passage of time inside her own spine as a growing, tingling static tension. It became more unbearable with every heartbeat. When the tension peaked near her cervical vertebrae, she knew the digits on the screen were just flipping to 0, and she would pull the lever. The resistance was always the same. Exactly 12 kilograms of pressure she had to exert with her entire shoulder to break the bolt. Hiss. That was the sound of equalizing pressure. A short, whistling exhale from the station. For a moment, the station regained its structural stability. Then came a second of dead silence, and the process began anew. 1, 2, 3. Once a researcher of pure energy, she had been reduced here to the role of a simple relay. She was an element of a biological circuit, a fuse that prevented Sector Delta from collapsing into nothingness. With every movement of her shoulder, she felt herself becoming more mechanical. Her thoughts, once complex, now revolved exclusively around the rhythm. Every second had its weight, its smell of ozone, and its metallic aftertaste. The 50th second of every cycle was the threshold. That was when her arm would spontaneously tense for movement, anticipating the brain's conscious decision. This was no longer will, but a terrifying autonomy of muscle memory. She looked at her fingers, clammed on the titanium. The skin on her knuckles had cracked long ago, but underneath, there was no redness of muscle tissue. She saw fine copper threads and blue optical fibers entwined around her bones, creating a sophisticated biomechanical network of connections directly into the lever. The system optimized her on the fly, removing redundant biological layers, so the impulse reached the mechanism with 0 delay. She felt no pain. She felt only the dry, technical correctness of her existence as a component. Instance number 7. Maintain the rhythm. The voice on the intercom was devoid of any human characteristics. It sounded like an echo generated by a dead processor. She did not answer. She knew that every word was an unnecessary expenditure of oxygen. The counter hit 0. C'est pour it. I said. The darkness flashed blue, showing her body marked as activator 0 to 1. The 500th minute began, or perhaps the 500th year of the same minute. The concept of time for Verena had ceased to exist beyond the 60-second interval. Sector Delta began to undergo a slow, nightmarish deformation. Airlock Seto -1 was no longer a cramped, technical room with bright walls. With every subsequent reset, the surroundings seemed to recede by millimeters, until finally, the walls vanished into an impenetrable. She now stood on a small, steel island suspended in absolute vacuum. From above, from an invisible ceiling, hung hundreds of blue cables. They waved slowly like the tentacles of a deep-sea predator. She no longer felt the weight of her own suit. Instead, she felt the pressure of reality itself pressing against her senses. As she pulled the lever, she felt the entire station strain and settle with a heavy groan. During the countdown, she began to notice figures. They appeared at the very edge of the blue light, motionless and silent. She recognized other instances in them. Elias with his empty, technical gaze, and another version of herself, whose hands still seemed to drip with fluorescent plasma. They did not try to save her. They were like archival records, ghosts written into the sector's memory. Verena wanted to scream, to ask if they too were trapped in their own loops. But when she opened her mouth, only a dry hum of a fan emerged. Her larynx and vocal cords had been integrated into the air circulation system. She had become a physical safety valve, part of an installation that did not need a voice, only a functioning trigger mechanism. Every breath was now synchronized with a rhythm of pumping blue liquid. In the 40th second of the current cycle, something happened that had no right to occur. The counter on the console stopped at the number 12. The red alarm light suddenly went out. The room was flooded with a soothing, deep white. She froze. Her arm, ready for effort, suddenly went limp. For a fraction of a second, she felt a surge of pure, primitive hope. She straightened her back, and the blue wires in her forearms loosened their grip. The silence lasted 10, 15, 20 seconds beyond the norm. She breathed deeply, feeling the smell of old dust in her lungs. She stared into the darkness. There were no screws or welds there. Everything was connected by blue, pulsing tissue that was slowly digesting the steel. She realized that the silence was not liberation. The system analyzed her reaction to the lack of stimulus. She was being watched by the very matter of the ship. Then the white light turned into a hateful red. The counter jumped from 12 straight to 0. The siren wailed so loudly that blue liquid squirted from her ears. The system was testing the limits of her reaction to an error. The jerk of the lever in that second was an act of animal desperation. It tore her shoulder out of its socket, but the mechanism engaged. The loop returned to normal, stronger and more ruthless. The darkness returned, and with it, the countdown. 1, 2, 3. The machine was satisfied. The crisis intensified with every subsequent turn of the counter. The airlock mechanism began to make sounds she could not identify. Deep, metallic grinds, as if hard minerals were being crushed inside the gears. The lever was becoming heavier, as if with every cycle the station was gaining mass. During the next countdown, she had to brace herself with both hands. The counter relentlessly moved down. 10, 9, 8. The blue light in the cables above her head pulsed intensely. It burned her retinas. Force parameter insufficient for maintaining integrity. The intercom announced the system demanded total commitment. She felt her body beginning to give way. Her bones were creaking under the pressure of forces exceeding the limits of biology. She had to achieve final integration to close the sector circuit. She drove her feet into the steel floor. Mechanical stabilizers shot out of her heels, screwing deep into the station's hull. Her left hand was brutally pulled to the side panel. It was welded to it in a fraction of a second by an electric arc, creating a permanent support for her chest. She became a living frame for the machine, a stationary structural element of airlock 0 to 1. 3 seconds left. She let out a sound that was a combination of a scream and a grinding turbine. The lever began to give way millimeter by millimeter, tearing the remnants of her human tendons. When the counter hit 0, the titanium handle snapped with a loud click. It echoed in the furthest corridors of Sector Delta. The hiss of air was like the last sigh of a dying god. A second of dead, absolute silence followed, completely fused with the console. She stared into the void before her. From the black mist emerged a spatial distortion, a tall, inhuman silhouette that simply materialized closer. It was a representation of the procedure, the cold will controlling the anomaly. The distortion touched her chest. She felt her consciousness being compressed and closed into a single line of code. Inside her chest, in the place of her heart, a black cube appeared. It immediately took over the function of pumping energy into her veins. There was no more pain, no more fear, only pure, mathematical necessity to endure remained. Asset 07. Ready for continuous operation. Synchronization complete. On the screen above her head, the number 60 appeared again. The countdown began anew, this time with perfect machine precision, without any material resistance. Part Uno. The finale was not an end, but a final transition into a state of stable looping. Verena ceased to perceive herself as a separate entity. She became Sector Delta. She felt every pipe, every valve, and every spark in the reactor. The leva she moved every minute was the only impulse of will she had left, a rigor that defined her existence. There was no longer any difference between her thinking and the work of the cooling pumps. Her brain became a coprocessor that optimized energy consumption during every cycle. She was a perpetual engine driving her own prison, steadfast and eternal like the vacuum itself. She felt every turn of the mechanism and every shudder of the hull as her own breath. She no longer needed oxygen. She knew that somewhere out there, stars could explode and civilizations could turn to dust. But she would pull the lever, because such was the nature of the universe. The loop ceased to be a punishment. It became the highest form of order. Every second had its mathematically calculated purpose. Sector Delta was no longer dead metal drifting in the void. It was a living organism of which she was the consciousness, locked in a cage of 60 seconds, designed for station, evolved to the rhythm of her work. The wires now pulsed in blue light, growing in the corridors like blood vessels. She felt it all. She felt the air resistance in sectors she had never reached, and the cold of the vacuum pressing against the outer hull. Every minute was a celebration of her functionality. She became the perfect servant to the process, an instance that asks no questions, feels no fatigue, and seeks no escape. The perfection of the procedure displaced all biological imperfections. In the darkness of Sector Delta, the only light was the blue glow of her new eyes. They never blinked again, staring into the infinity of the next countdown. The last memory was archived as a corrupted record deep within the database. In it, she saw a face whose name she could no longer recall, smiling in the glow of a sun whose color had been erased from her registers. The image was covered in thick, blue noise, like an old, burnt tape. She no longer felt sadness. Sadness was a calculation error, an inefficient expenditure of energy. It was removed during the last reset. As the counter once again approached zero, she pulled the lever with the power of a machine. She had finally found her destiny in infinity. Idlock Center 1 was her entire universe. She was its sole guardian, recreating it every minute so it could survive in the dark. Cycle installation complete. Assetto 7 synchronized with Delta Core. Register stable. Awaiting instructions for remaining instances. The voice on the intercom fell silent. The only sound was the steady, metallic ticking of the counter. 1, 2, 3, 4. The procedure continued. while the last remnants of humanity evaporated in the blue glow.
Earth, the Ark Laboratory, File 09113.
Thomas looked at the screen, where rows of blue digits scrolled with unnatural, mechanical speed. There were no longer any heart rate graphs, no temperature readings, or camera feeds, only a counter that reset to its starting value every 60 seconds, unchanged for an hour. Another corrupted sector. Verena, he said quietly, rubbing his tired eyes with his hand. Just a data loop. The system claims it's a write error in Sector Delta. An old script that got looped in the It's just static noise. Nothing worth wasting time on before the end of the shift. Verena did not answer immediately. She sat motionless at her terminal, staring at her hands. In the cold, cadaverous light of the laboratory's fluorescent lamps, for fractions of a second, it seemed to her that under her skin, a faint blue impulse was flowing. It moved to the rhythm of the clock ticking on the wall, but when she blinked, she saw only her own tired skin. Yes, Thomas. Just noise. Load the next file. How much time do we have left until midnight?
Do you want to be part of this story? Support our project. Buycoffee.to/butterflyproject.